Good evening, everybody, and so happy that you, Scott, have accepted our humble offer to join in at Laksam online. We are online and on site today, and I'm very happy that you could come here and teach about the four schools of reality, the four tenets, and I'm pretty sure that you will explain it a lot and give us a good understanding through meditation and explanations and maybe also questions. And welcome to everybody to joining in tonight. About Scott, he's the founder and host of the meditation podcast, A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. And he's also a 20-year Stoic student of Tibetan Buddhism and a student of our own Venerable Radi Frösi and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Venerable Bina, Sangi Kadro, at least that's what I've heard, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And due to this inspiration, he leads meditations that sort of infuse the pure lineage of the great Buddhist masters with science, humor, and the realities of the modern world. And there's also a book coming out. Maybe we can also hear a little about that in the end. It's a book called How to Train a Happy Mind. I'm looking forward to buying it. And the reason for asking Scott, to come in and give the teachings, the series of teaching, is that I'm doing the basic program at Jamyang London and got exposed to these four schools of reality, the tenets, and really got a lot of confused. And then I heard Scott do these teachings on it, and I said, "Oh, we need that," because that really set a lot of basic structure to the ground, and I understood it a little better. So, and it inspired me to question my own beliefs, the way I thought I understood reality, the way I wanted to understand it, like the school called Prasangika, which is the highest school. And I really thought that was what I was trying to understand. But so I was forced to really scrutinize my own mind and consider, do I really also believe that's that is what I'm doing? So thank you for joining in, and I will happily hand over the word to you, Scott.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. Preparing this class, I got invited to teach this class first at the Jamyang Center in London, and it was, I think it's the hardest thing I ever did Dharma-wise to try to prepare for the class. But I'm happy with the way it turned out, and I think it's I'm not an expert in tenets. It's a very difficult topic. I've studied multiple times, and I think only very advanced practitioners, and probably mostly the ones who speak Tibetan, who truly understand it. But I think there's a lot we can get out of this topic, and it can be presented in this complementary way that's more experiential and a little bit more simplified and modernized to see how we can get the most benefit from the topic. Anyway, I'd like to start the class with a meditation. I find it really helps my mind and everyone's mind just to meditate for 1 minute. It gets you into a much more settled state for the rest of the class. So just get yourself into meditation posture. And I'm sure all of you know what that is. And all we're going to do is have a positive motivation. You know, there's one of my favorite motivations is that there's nothing better we could be doing for the next 2 hours than trying to understand the Dharma a little bit better and sincerely practice it, both to make our own lives happy and meaningful and for the benefit of everyone we encounter in life. So just meditate on the breath for 1 minute. then we can come out and get into the class. Isn't it amazing just what 1 minute a meditation does for you? I like to remember that, because sometimes my friends say like they lost their meditation habit. I say, well, try just 1 minute a day. Sorry, everyone has one extra minute. So I'm going to get into the class. There's a lot of material, 4 classes for 4 schools. When you study attendance, we break it into a little bit more schools, but we just do 4 classes in the 4 major schools. So this is one of the most advanced, complicated topics in Tibetan Buddhism, which we call tenets. And it talks about these 4 increasingly subtle views on reality that Buddhism evolved over time in its different schools and the different teachings given by the Buddha, and then these great masters like Vasubandhu and Nagarjuna. And it also talks about some other teachings, like the advanced stages we go through as we become enlightened, which I'm not going to talk about during this class. I like to start off just with the question I think I asked myself when I first started this topic, which is, what's the point of studying this topic? And Robert Thurman came out with a book last year called Wisdom is Bliss. And he put it really simply there, that if we are able to see reality correctly, reality is good. He says that our life is joyful and meaningful and filled with love and connections if we just see reality the way it is, or closer to the way it is. So that's the point of studying this topic. And I think it's important to emphasize that, to have a happy, meaningful life by aligning our minds with the way that things exist. And so, studying and even debating these 4 progressive ways of seeing reality, it's not just an intellectual exercise, but it's a key to a happy, meaningful, effective life. Because Buddhism says there are 2 things we need to evolve our mind toward its greatest potential. One is method, which is doing good in the world and conditioning our minds. And the other is wisdom, of correctly seeing reality. So what's wrong with our everyday way of seeing reality? The ordinary way of seeing reality makes us falsely see ourselves as separate from others. I like this simple way of thinking about it, just feeling separate. And an ordinary way of seeing things also makes objects and actions in the world seem independent and discrete instead of interdependent and interconnected. So when we see reality in this more interdependent manner, it helps break down what they say is the root cause of our mental suffering. In a simple way, you can say self-centeredness, which is kind of the grosser form of ignorance, kind of like an attachment to yourself, and the sense of separateness, the other form of ignorance, which is just feeling separate. So in this class, we're going to focus on gaining an experiential understanding of the 4 progressive views of conventional and ultimate reality. And each of these 4 schools attacks the ignorance of seeing things as separate and independent in different ways. But I think a key is that all of them are effective in breaking down the delusions as we experience them, and they were all taught by the Buddha at different times. So another thing to mention is that it's also quite possible that one of the approaches may be more effective for your own individual mind at breaking down reality than another. And I was just studying this topic with the Geshe here, who teaches up in Richmond, and he really emphasized that the schools aren't meant to be seen as one superior to another, but rather suitable for different minds at different times. I think that's very, very important. And I definitely had that misunderstanding when I started too. So when you look at the differences between the school, the debate comes in, there are these debates that come into play, just like in physics, with these precise details about how people and how minds and objects exist. And in general, Buddhism talks about 2 types of reality, conventional reality and ultimate reality, or conventional truth and ultimate truth. And conventional reality in general is the way that things appear to us when we don't deeply examine them. And then ultimate reality is supposed to be, well, ultimate. It's the way that things truly exist when you, upon the deepest examination and understanding. But we all know there's a lot of debate about ultimate reality. And also, I think there's a measure of humility and awe and curiosity that we can bring to these questions too. We may, in the search, I think one thing I realized meditating, over the years is that the questions are sometimes more important than the answers. In fact, you may never find an answer. And that's what they say, one of the main ways of meditating emptiness is not finding, searching and not finding. So like I was saying, it's easy to approach this topic of tenets with the idea of getting it right, like you do at school or university, at least in the West, that there's the highest school in our lineage, the Prasangika Madhyamaka, that's supposed to be the subtlest and the most accurate view on how things exist. And that's the approach that we're going to meditate on the last class, the last of the 4 classes. But the other 3 approaches have their merits, and they were taught by the Buddha for different audiences, it's said, and they were also upheld and debated by brilliant minds for thousands of years. One of the examples I love is Vasubandhu himself, who evolved his belief at least through 3 and maybe through 4 of the schools in his own lifetime. And so he was such a wise practitioner, and if he himself, evolved his mind through them through 3 or 4 schools in his lifetime, then I think, it's worth each of us considering that too. Something else to mention is that the supposedly lower views are doctrines that other schools of Buddhism still adhere to. So, for example, all these different views on reality were and still are held by different schools of Buddhism, and also other, types of spiritual traditions. So, for example, the atomist school, in general, is the one that some Theravada schools still adhere to, and which has brought deep realizations, and is said to have even brought enlightenment to numerous people over the last 2,000 years. Vast numbers of people supposedly. And when I studied this topic with Venerable Rene, he approached it as an invitation. That was the first time I had this experiential approach, that we could explore each of these views of reality with an open mind and try to see what we each believe and how much we believe in each school or relate to each school. So, for example, if you're really a mind-only adherent, it's good to admit that to yourself and to see the benefits of this approach rather than pretending like I'm a good advanced middle way thinker. So, and I mentioned that because that's the approach that comes really naturally to me. I was raised in a religion called Christian Science, which is, it's not Scientology. It's a religion that was founded about 150 years ago. And this religion, it's well known because the church members generally don't go to doctors. They heal themselves through prayer. But something few people know is that this religion has a mind-only approach, that all of reality is mental, and that the physical aspect of reality is like an illusion or a shadow or a projection. So I was raised that way, so I naturally think that way. I'm not a Christian Scientist any longer, but my own mind naturally thinks that way, and I think and I find it very beneficial using the Buddhist mind-only approach quite often. Also, the Vaibhashika approach, supposedly the lowest school that talks about partless particles, this one conforms very closely to the mechanistic scientific view of reality made up of space and atoms. The reality of physics as it evolved from Newton up to Einstein. And then after that comes the 20th century quantum mechanical reality that is debated and interpreted sometimes in what seems like a mind-only way, and then other times like a middle way, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So another part of the class that I'm really excited about, and I'll talk about with each school, is the scientific analogs to the 4 schools. Something else in the class is that I'm going to try my best to avoid jargon wherever I can, although it's not completely possible, because the names of the schools themselves are jargon. However, outside of that, I try to use plain, educated language rather than specific Buddhist terminology, like some of you are familiar with, like words like object possessors. Very, very tricky terms. It's hard to understand what they mean. Just so that we don't get lost in unfamiliar terms and we can stay together in a wonderful exploration of reality that doesn't hurt your head so much. It genuinely, I was actually talking to Lars before, how much it genuinely broke my brain when I was trying to understand the difference between the terms true and valid and correct when you study tenets in our tradition, because there's different definitions for those three words. that was one of the things that really I found quite discouraging. So in the class, I've simplified the 8 sub-schools into 4 main schools for the sake of convenience and clarity. So I'm going to just detail that a little bit for the people that are more familiar with it. So for example, Yogacara gets grouped in with Chittamatra, the mind-only school. And we don't talk about the Satantrika Madhyamaka, the autonomy school, but we focus on the Praisangika Madhyamaka, the middle way consequent school. Anyway, sorry for breaking my no jargon rule, but I just want to mention that for the people who have studied the topic before and note some simplifications. The class is also going to involve more meditation than discussion. I'm a lot more comfortable meditating on these topics than precisely and correctly explaining them according to the outlines and the academic terminology. Lately, I've been going into this topic a lot more because I was trying to write about it, and I was more and more convinced that it's much easier to meditate on emptiness than to write about emptiness or talk about emptiness. And you have much better sources than me for the academic approaches to the topic, like Geshe Namdak, who you've been learning from. So in the classes, we'll have some introduction to each topic, but I'm going to try to spend more time in meditation and then hopefully leave a good amount of time for discussion at the end. Sometimes, you know how it goes. Sometimes the meditations might stretch longer and the discussion might get cut off a little bit, but I'm going to do my best to leave enough time for questions so we can talk about our experience together and raise questions and share insights. So often the question and answer is one of the funnest parts of a class. So the reason to focus on meditation is to remember that the purpose of these conceptualizations of reality is ultimately to go beyond concepts to a direct experience of reality. So the Buddhist view of the mind says the direct experience is truer to how things actually exist, that when our conceptual mind activates, we literally create the conceptual experiences that break us out of that truer reality. So when we think or say tree or Lars or a teacup, those unexamined thoughts themselves counter seeing reality as it is, if that makes sense. Like once you recognize the thing, it introduces a gulf between you and the thing, like the being seeing, yourself, and the thing being seen. It's a duality. Whereas in reality, they're not separate. But then there is a path. What I do like to mention, though, is that there is a path back to non-duality through our senses, and especially with pleasure. This is something Renee taught us, and as someone who's very big on attachment, I think I like to try to understand how to take pleasure into the path from a Mahayana perspective, not necessarily from a Vajrayana perspective. So when experiences feel good and we aren't overly attached to them or neurotic about losing them, we can have this feeling of transcending duality, like merging with the object, our partner or a delicious piece of cake or a beautiful forest, right? If you can do it without attachment, like you can, again, move past the concepts to a feeling of non-duality. Like it can happen when you're deeply listening to a friend, teaching a child, the kind of attention you need for a child, helping a stranger, or even taking part in a class like this. So I like to mention that because there's like a full circle between like duality and non-duality, like this initial like non-dualistic perception you talk about, like the first moment of consciousness, then like the divided conceptualization, but then you can use the completely being completely present and non-attached to kind of merge back those dualities we feel in everyday life. Anyway, so to summarize, each of the four schools' views on reality helps us break down the illusion of independence and, more coarsely selfishness that are at the root of our suffering as human beings. The course doesn't attempt to explain the four schools with academic rigor, but rather offers an experiential tour of the schools through meditation, where we try and see reality through each of the schools' lenses with modern scientific and psychological language. So in meditation, we'll look openly and critically at how reality feels according to each school and try and break through the conceptualization of the philosophy to a direct experience. And then when we come out of meditation, we'll honestly consider whether our own view aligns with one or more of these views without uncritically asserting that the most advanced view is correct, just because someone says it's true. We'll taste them all in contemplation. So why don't we get right into the first school then? That's just an introduction to the class. So let's just jump right in. The first view of reality is called Vaibhashika, and the English language term for this school is Great Exposition, which honestly means nothing to me. I think it's nice just to be honest about how these words, kind of sound to us. Like, what does the Great Exposition mean? So a nickname for this school is realists. And I personally like the term atomists. And that's because a core view on reality of this school is that all material things can be broken down into partless particles, or as we call them, atoms. And this school also believes that all mental phenomena can also be broken down into indivisible atomic moments of consciousness. So that's not so hard to understand that simplified version of the school. So for the purpose of this school, the definition of an atom is the older definition of an atom, like the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Democritus talked about, where an atom is an indivisible building block of reality, and atoms move about in the void of space. Because we now know that atoms can be divided into smaller building blocks, and through quantum theory, we know that matter can even pop in and out of existence based on, the mathematics of probabilistic waves. But for the purpose of this first atomist school, try and set your mind in a view of reality like you learned in grade school, where atoms, or at least their subparts, electrons, protons, neutrons, are indivisible final building blocks of reality. And you're in good company with this view. The great scientists saw reality like this. Newton saw reality this way. Even Einstein, who was big on relativity, but not as much on quantum mechanics. He was very disturbed by quantum mechanics. Both of them believed in a mechanistic universe with finite building blocks and predictable rules. So in each school, emptiness is a synonym for reality, that reality is empty. But the way each school defines emptiness differs. So each of the schools talks about emptiness or selflessness in progressively subtler ways, and sometimes in ways that differ between the emptiness of people, thinking beings, and the emptiness of phenomena. So in the first two schools, only persons are accepted as empty, while in the latter two schools, phenomena are also seen to be empty. And then what are they empty of? So emptiness means being empty of something. And the simplest way of approaching, and I put simplest in quotes, I think the simplest way of approaching emptiness is already very beneficial. And it says that a person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So to put it, they often say with emptiness, you can only define it negatively, but as what's being negated. But to put it in positive language, we're impermanent, we're made of parts, and we're interdependent. So we're impermanent because we change. Our mind and our body change moment to moment, and you can subjectively observe this. Right? We're made of parts. We're not a solid unitary physical or mental entity. And we're interdependent. The changing parts of our body and mind don't come about and transform by themselves, but due to various other causes and conditions. So impermanent parts, interdependent. These things seem pretty straightforward. But most of the time, and they seem true, right? They're arguably true. I think there's few people you couldn't make this convincing argument, that we're impermanent, we're made of parts, we're interdependent. But most of the time, at least for me, when we talk or think about ourselves, we act as if we're permanent, unitary, and partless. And that's the problem. So even though we can intellectually understand selflessness, it doesn't infuse our thinking and break down our delusions of separateness or selfishness. So the first three schools share the idea that coarse selflessness can be described this way. And then they also maintain that there's a more subtle selflessness that also must be negated, which is the belief of an I that controls or owns the impermanent, interdependent parts. So when you hear that, especially if you grew up as an educated scientific Westerner, it may sound funny, believing in a separate I from those parts, because on the surface, that one seems more primitive, like believing that there's, supernatural, believing that there's some immaterial separate self that owns our body and mind. Is that the soul? But again, a lot of people, so many people are irreligious today. I think many people would say, I don't believe in a soul. And yet, if you really interrogate your mind, you would see that you have a sense of an owner of these, interdependent parts. So again, I think here's where it's good to interrogate yourself and see whether you might, in fact, believe in such a self. Because if we look at our language, we're always talking about this self. Even non-religious people who say they don't believe in a soul. When we say my body or my mind, whose body and mind are we talking about? Right? This is the more subtle self that the first three schools say also has to be refuted in logic and meditation. And I think this is one of these kind of basic points that can make the tenets very much more grounded, is to see how we really do see this permanent, partless, independent self, despite us claiming we might not believe in it. So then, the first three schools say, this is the self to be refuted. There's a final, more subtle view of selflessness in the middle way school that we'll meditate on in the last class. But in this class, we'll focus on this first school, and the rest of the class is going to be meditations that try to bring us experientially into the topic. So today we're going to meditate on the atomist view of phenomena. I really like using this term. I like using terms that give you a sense of what the concept is, without knowing jargon. So I'm very fond of this term atomist. So today we're going to meditate on the atomist view of phenomena. And so for those tracking the terminology, this is the Vaibhashika realist great exposition school. And it's said that this was the only view in the first 100 or so years following the Buddha's first teachings, and that it aligns more or less with the Theravada perspective on reality, though, I'm not an expert in that tradition. And then, so that's one meditation. And then we're also going to meditate on the Vaibhashika atomist view of coarse selflessness, the non-existence of a permanent, partless, independent person. So those are the two meditations. And between them, we'll take a break. Okay, so let me get ready for that. And I think we can save the questions for the end, especially after we have some experience meditating. Okay, so settle yourself into a meditation posture, cross-legged with your seat raised if you're on the floor or on your bed, or in a chair with your legs out and down, uncrossed, feet flat on the floor, spine straight. Try to relax your shoulders, the muscles in your face, your eyes, your brow, tilt down your head. Half close your eyes if you like to do that. Relax your mouth. Then set your motivation for your meditation. That one from the start is kind of nice. There's nothing better I could be doing right now, and wishing to create the true causes for happiness and meaning in our lives and deeper connections with others, and whatever we can to do good in the world. May these meditations bring out our best qualities. Then feel like that there's a big, vast space of light in front of you, like a foggy field, but where every single particle of fog glows, has a little light emanating from it. And that field is the space of all good qualities: kindness, love, generosity, patience, the qualities of enlightened being, wisdom, love, compassion. And if you know anyone who embodies those qualities, teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or people in your own life, mix their minds with that space. And then feel that space advance toward you until it envelops you and your own body becomes light, filled with those qualities. And the barriers you normally feel between yourself and others break down a little bit. As you see that we're all capable of letting go of delusions and letting our natural good qualities emerge, perhaps limitlessly, till the state they call enlightenment. Then once again, just focus on the breath for a minute or so to stabilize the mind. So now we're going to delve into the early Buddhist view of phenomena, how non-thinking objects exist. There's an ultimate and a relative truth in each school of reality. And in this one, the ultimate truth of phenomena is the point where we find the indivisible parts of an object. Whereas relative truth or conventional reality is the level of reality where parts come together into more complex phenomena. In this school, there's no sense of selflessness of phenomena. Phenomena really exist, and you can find their essence in their parts. Objects exist before you perceive them. So let's search together and see if we agree. This view of reality isn't one to look down on. It's the same view that geniuses like Newton or Plato adhered to. The reality that science believed to be true until the discovery of quantum mechanics. So bring to mind some external object to examine how it exists. It can be helpful to choose some external object that you have some strong attachment toward, because this meditation isn't just an intellectual exercise, but one that's meant to break down the destructive emotions we have toward objects. So for a modern person, a phone is ready at hand and maybe our most prized possession after our body. Something we get anxious about when we're parted from it, even for a minute. So maybe you can choose that object today for the meditation. Or you might choose your car or your house or apartment or cozy room, or some type of food that you often crave, your favorite meal. So once you have this object of attachment in mind, first acknowledge that it does bring you some conventional pleasure, and it's useful and beneficial in many ways to your life. And we can feel grateful for that. Then we dive deeper. So we seek to understand some of the ways in which we mistakenly see the object, and also the simple wonder of how that object comes together and functions, even though it's just a collection of parts. To come to know reality better, we examine the parts of our object, looking at the object objectively, the way science tells us it exists. So you start with the bigger, more obvious parts of the object. And as you consider each of these parts, consider whether the phone or car or house or delicious food can be found in that part. So if you're thinking of a phone, can it be found in its screen, its computer chips, its case or battery or buttons? If it's a car, do you find it in its wheels or its chassis, its engine, its windows? If you think of your home or apartment, imagine its foundations and framing, floors, walls, ceiling, electrical fixtures, gas and plumbing. Is the house found in any of these parts? If you're thinking of food like a piece of cake, think of the flour, the sugar, the eggs, the butter. If you had all these ingredients separated out on a plate, would you find them as appealing? So just for a minute, think specifically about your object and reflect on the parts and whether the object is more or less identified with any of those parts. Then go a little more deeply. So with the phone, examine the man-made materials of glass and plastic and its electronic components, resistors, capacitors, wires, sensors. If it's a car, the rubber, glass, plastic, heavy steel frame, lighter aluminum sheets. With your house or your room, the materials that it's made of: wood, wire, latex, glass, plastic, plaster, brick, mortar, concrete. Or with food, the raw plants and animals the ingredients came from: wheat, chicken and eggs, cows and cow's milk, sugar cane, fruits, vegetables. As we consider these parts of our object, do we come closer to finding the essence of the object that attracts us, or further away? So look at your object silently for a minute. And then we go even deeper to the atomic level, to the elements these objects are made of. It turns out that your phone contains almost every element in the periodic table. 70 of the 80 or so naturally occurring elements. Indium, tin, and oxygen on the touchscreen display that you touch with your finger every time you interact with it. The processor made of silicone, but also phosphorus, antimony, arsenic, boron, indium, gallium. The screen made of a special glass of silicon dioxide, aluminum, magnesium, sodium, potassium. Gold, silver, and copper making up the electrical connections inside. Tantalum filling the capacitors that regulate energy flow. Some of these elements you may never even have heard of: the rare earth metals, yttrium, europium, terbium, gadolinium, form the glowing red, green, and blue of the screen's pixels. The battery made of lithium, cobalt, nickel. Praseodymium and neodymium used in the phone's speakers and vibrating motors. Think about the elements of a car, your car if you have one. Aluminum in the body panels and wheels. Iron, bismuth, calcium, and carbon in steel. Chlorine, hydrogen, and oxygen in the polyvinyl chloride plastics, the moldings, trims. gold and copper in the electrical system circuits, helium used in creating many auto parts, magnesium used in subframes, oil pans, trunks, and the precious metal platinum found in the catalytic converter if you have a gas car that reduces the pollution. Your house or your room around you is made mostly of natural materials. Wood is mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Pipes and wires and nails are made of copper, iron, gold, and aluminum. Plaster is composed of calcium, sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. Paints contain zinc, oxygen, sulfur, titanium, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Or if you're thinking about food, it's made mostly of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, spiced with little bits of phosphorus, sodium chloride, sulfur, and calcium. Try and step back and imagine your object of contemplation broken down into piles and vats of the elements that comprise it. So imagine the 70 little piles of granulated matter on your desk that make up your phone. Or imagine huge piles of the dozen elements that make up your car stacked in front of your house. Or imagine the thousands of pounds of elements in huge piles that make up your house or apartment, vats of carbon, copper, iron, aluminum, calcium, containers with gases and liquids, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Or imagine your dinner plate with neat piles of carbon, phosphorus, sodium chloride, sulfur, calcium, paired with little glass containers of oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. How delicious would that seem? So for a minute, try and conjure the same emotional attachment you feel to these piles of elements. Where did the object go when we broke up the parts in our mind? Do these parts themselves have the same allure? Is our love of our phone, home, car, or meal a love of their parts individually? And if we can't find the object in any of its individual parts, how does it make sense that it's in the sum of them? These piles of elements that we imagine, they still have qualities, colors, textures, tastes, smells. But when we move our minds below the atomic level to take our analysis one step further, we arrive at the invisible world of the subatomic, where there's no longer color or form or taste or touch or sound. Atoms are almost entirely empty space, with their subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, zipping around at incredible speed. For the purpose of this first school of reality, the atomists stop now at this level and try and see reality ending here. That the subatomic particles are indivisible. That these are the fundamental building blocks of reality. Try and picture your phone, home, car, or meal for a moment as this incredibly active cloud of particles. And focus on that for a moment. How your object exists as a collection of indivisible parts. The parts are ultimate reality, and the collection of parts, relative reality. So now pull back like that famous movie, Powers of 10, zooming back to the conventional level, where the illusion of the phone, car, home, or meal appears to your senses. See if you can observe the object in both ways, to see its conventional way of appearing with form, color, texture, and sound, but at the same time with your mind and intellect, seeing through to its ultimate reality from the point of view of the atomist school, that ultimately every object is its subatomic particles. So what does this meditation do to your mind? Does it soften the edges of the strong feelings you have toward your object? Does it give you a deeper sense of awe and wonder? Does this way of seeing the object help in any way with your disturbing emotions? By seeing that there are colorless, minute particles that underlie all of the tasty, tempting reality, does it help in any way to reduce our attachment to things or anger at not having things? So ask honestly, and it's okay to say, no, I'm still attached to this pile of atoms, but see how you really think for a moment. And then as you come out of this meditation, you can make an aspiration to continue trying to see things this way during the week, especially when strong feelings of attachment or aversion arise toward objects. See if you can see through the illusion of a solid object existing conventionally to its ultimate reality in this first school of being, comprised of minute subatomic parts. And then you can come out of the meditation. So let's take a tiny break. This is exactly 1 hour in. So why don't we take a 5-minute break? And then we're going to come back and meditate on the coarse selflessness of this atomist Vaibhashika school. So I'll see you back in 5 minutes. All right, I think we're ready to go back into meditation. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, okay. Okay, so settle yourself back into meditation posture. Found this great quote by one of the early writers on Buddhism and psychology, Jack Engler. He said, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody, which I really like. And so that's the reason to progressively explore and break down the self. First, seeing the self in its illusory way. So in this first Vaibhashika atomist school, we have a coarse sense of selflessness and a subtle sense of selflessness. And these are actually shared among the first 3 schools. So we'll divide them into different days. So today we'll meditate on the coarse selflessness of person according to the first 3 schools. So this sense of selflessness looks at the person or the self in quotes and searches for a permanent, partless, independent person, which they say doesn't exist when we analyze and eventually take our analysis deeper to a level of realization. So in this school, we look at the parts of the body and the mind searching for the self, and surprise, we do find him or her or they. And I'll leave it as a little bit of a surprise as to where we find the self, if you don't already know it. because it's good to go into this meditation with a genuine curiosity and an openness to whatever you find. So stabilize your mind again with a couple of breaths, trying to give them your full attention. Now we move into asking the question, who am I? The root source of our suffering is said to be our clinging to an unrealistic view of ourself as permanent, partless, and independent. So even hearing these words, you might say, of course I know I'm not any of those things. And if that's the case, that's great. But examine these three mistaken ways of seeing yourself for a moment. We see ourselves as permanent when we forget that we're on a continual arc of change through life. We were born. We were given a label of Scott or Lars or Fabienne, and will eventually die. So do we see ourselves on this arc of life, changing even now? Or do we have a more solid view of a self that somehow has always been and always will be? Do we remember that we're made up of organs and cells, molecules and atoms, of constantly changing thoughts and feelings and perceptions? Or do we feel a more unitary sense of a singular self that's greater than the sum of these changing parts? Do we see ourselves as interdependent with the people and forces and cultures around us? Or do we feel like an autonomous agent who has desires and dislikes, who feels independent and separate from the world around us? Someone who achieves things on one's own without depending on others. So these are some of the questions that start to chip away at the illusion of a separate self. We're not destroying the notion of a conventional self that lives and breathes and interacts with others, but we're trying to dissolve this diluted sense of self that seems independent from the forces and the beings around us. The process of meditating on the self was taught by the Buddha as a meditation on what he called the 5 aggregates. But these 5 aggregates really break into 2 categories, the material body and the immaterial mind. The first aggregate of form refers to the body, and then the other 4 aggregates refer to the mind, a specific way of organizing our different mental experiences so that we can better see how our mind operates. In this meditation, we first search for ourself in our body, starting with the gross parts of your body. Ask yourself, can I find myself in my feet, in my legs, my torso, my liver or heart or lungs? Am I my kidneys, my stomach, my arms or hands? When we get to our head, we can ask if our self can be found among our sense organs that bring in sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches that the self reacts to, liking, disliking, or indifferent to them. Do I find myself in my eyes, my ears, my nose, my tongue, or my skin? What about in my blood, circulating once a minute through my body? Or in any of the cells of my body? Can I be found in the electrical and chemical signals passing through the neurons and limbic system? Can I be found in my DNA or my microbiome of billions of cooperating bacteria inside me? Then ask if I can be found in my brain. Is that where the self can be found? If you find yourself in your brain, where exactly? On the left side? The right side? In any single neuron or in the collection of them? Neuroscientists have asked this question too, and they've shown that when someone reflects on their strong sense of self, the brain activates in many different areas, and these areas are different for different people at different times. There's no self organ in the brain, no central control center, no pinpoint of activity that lights up when we have a strong sense of self, and that if we removed it, we'd lose our sense of self. But ask yourself this question honestly, probe for a moment quietly, whether you are your brain or any of the other gross parts of your body, just for a minute. Now go further below the cellular level to individual molecules. Our bodies are mostly made of water. Are we the water in our body? Or are we the electrolytes or the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, vitamins? Then descend to the atomic level. Are we the oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus that make up our body's main elements? Are we the subatomic particles, the electrons and protons and neutrons exchanging at enormous speed within our body's matter? As you search for yourself among these parts, ask yourself, am I any one of them? Or am I the collection of them? And in this school, take on the view for now that I do find my body at the particulate level, that my body as an aggregate is the conventional level of reality, and its ultimate reality rests in these indivisible subatomic parts. And then we move on to searching for this separate self in the mind. We start by probing the parts of the mind that respond to sensory and mental phenomena. The first one is feeling, the second aggregate after form, Feeling is the way that we respond with pleasant feelings to experiences we like, with unpleasant feelings to those we don't, and with indifferent feelings to the rest. So am I the pleasant feelings that I have when I hear kind words, when I see beautiful sights, when I smell and taste food that I love? Am I the good feelings that arise through my skin and muscles to hugs and kisses from people close to me? Am I the good feelings in my body that arise when I take a walk or work out or experience a physical thrill? Or do I identify with unpleasant feelings like those I have when I'm uncomfortable or when my body is hurt or when I'm criticized, attacked, blamed, or ignored? Do I identify with the neutral feelings of indifference I have when I pass a stranger or when I'm served by an assistant at a store? Try not to let your analysis stop at feelings, but see if you can further break down these feelings. If you look closely at your mind, you can see that there's a moment when a feeling arises in response to some sensory or mental event. You can watch it grow, sustain, diminish, and disappear. Are you any of these sub moments of feeling? Or are you all of them? In this view, the moments of feeling stop at an indivisible moment of consciousness. They say the duration of a finger snap. So imagine that your feelings can be broken down into these little atomic units of feeling that march through your consciousness, one after the other, and that this is the ultimate reality of feeling. But next, we see if we can find ourselves in the third aggregate, the mental factor of perception. This is the part of our mind that takes some bundle of reality and labels it, a collection of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids on a clay plate as our dinner, a collection of plant cells as a flower, a collection of metal and glass and almost all the elements on earth that come together as our phone. So are we this aspect of our mind that takes the continuity of invisible electromagnetic reality and through the senses labels it with colors and forms and sounds and tastes, touches and tactile sensations? None of these exist absolutely and independently from the mind. Even Newton and Galileo understood that our sensory experience is psychological. There's no blue or sweet or pain or pleasure that exists outside our minds in the invisible universe of electromagnetic energy. So are we our perception? That ability of our mind to wrap bundles of sensory experience with the label of home, phone, dinner, or me? And as you do this analysis, try and see these moments of perception as also indivisible, broken down into little packets of perception that come one after the other. Still there? Testing.
Looks like Scott has logged out and trying to log in again. I hope that will solve the thing. Yes, we are ready. Thank
Sorry
you.
about, I don't know why my computer just crashed, but anyway, we were on perception. We're meditating on perception, so it's probably good. All right, try to settle yourself back into that. So feeling and perception are two of the most powerful mental factors operating in our mind. But there are dozens more that are categorized into the fourth aggregate that's called volition or mental formation. Really, it's mental formation, but volition can dominate it. So one way to think of this aggregate is as our will. It's the thing that drives us to action. So you can ask yourself if you're any of the other mental experiences in your mind that differentiate the intricacies of reality. Are you your mental experience of jealousy or pride or love or compassion or even democracy or justice? If you do identify more strongly with one of your other mental factors, ask yourself what happens to the I when one mental experience dissolves into a new one. Give yourself a moment to probe any aspect of your mental experience to see if yourself can be found in any of them. And in this meditation today, try to see these mental experiences as atomic, coming as indivisible moments of each mental factor, or the dominant one of volition, urge. And then the last place to search in this 5-part analysis of the aggregates is the fifth aggregate of awareness itself, the space of consciousness or mental experience apart from the mental factors that flow through it. So try now and let your attention move away from the contents of your mental experience to the container of your mental experience. As you relax into the space of your mind, does it appear to have any qualities? Does it appear large and spacious or small and confined? Is it luminous or dark? Does the mind have a clarity to it, or is it fuzzy and obscured? Does the mind have a sense of knowing or reflecting what appears to it? Or is it indifferent to the mental factors that arise within its space? Thoughts and feelings will inevitably emerge within the spaciousness of the mind. But pay attention only to where they emerge from and where they dissolve back into. What is that ground from which mental factors emerge within the mind? You may experience some intuitive sense of the space of your mind, And you can let yourself relax into this experience for a moment. Is this the ultimate place where the inherent I can finally pin itself in the space of the mind? If you decide that's true, inquire further. If we divide the space of the mind in half, is this I in one side or the other? If we keep subdividing the space of the mind into little cubes of mental space, can you find yourself in any one of them? If you don't find yourself in any one of them, can you definitively find yourself as the collection of all these cubes of mental space? Mind also has a temporal aspect, individual, indivisible moments of consciousness that arise, grow, sustain, diminish, and disappear. Some of these have mental factors riding within them. Others are free from thought and remain in the direct experience of unobstructed mind itself. So, for the purpose of this school's meditation, imagine that this is the limit. Our course selflessness is not finding the self in the sum of the aggregates, but finding the self within the five aggregates, finding our body in its indivisible particles, finding the mind in individual moments of consciousness and mental factors. This is the course selflessness in the first three schools. So contemplate for a moment, does this view of the self help curb a sense of separateness, ego, attachment, aversion? And try to let go of thinking, let go of analysis, let go of concepts. That's the whole point of the meditation. Let go into what feels like a non-conceptual understanding of yourself that transcends ego grasping, that transcends labels, that transcends any one part of you or the collection of parts, indivisible particles, indivisible moments of consciousness. And now return to concepts. See how you do indeed exist. You haven't negated yourself in any way by breaking down your body and mind into partless particles and discrete moments of awareness. Even in this wholly scientific view, I'm so much more than I thought I was. The independent, unchanging, partless view of myself is so limiting and narrow and inaccurate. The separateness that arises from this incorrect view of the self, it's unnecessary when we become aware of our interdependent, changing self that's composed of countless physical parts and mental moments. We're so much more alive and changing and interdependent than our narrow ego imposes on us. But what this meditation shows is that when that narrow egotistic self arises, we can now see that moment as a gift, showing us the false, inherent, separate I that doesn't exist the way it seems. The rising of this separate sense of I gives us the opportunity to perform this magnificent analysis of how we truly exist and embrace a greater sense of self that's interdependent with all other life and everything else in the universe. And then you can come out of the meditation.
Yes, and you can raise your virtual hand or your real life hand if you have a question or any comment, maybe.
Very confident. Okay.
Alicia.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Lars and Laxam, for organizing this. It's wonderful. I have a very basic question about the definition of the two truths, which you gave at the beginning, like the relative truth being how the way we perceive reality prior to any analysis, and the truth being what reality actually is, which certainly differs in all the schools. But does this definition apply to all the schools? Is it valid in all the schools?
No. And also, like, that way, if I said that, it might be slightly incorrect because
sorry, maybe I miss.
No,
sure
it's okay. Right. But in general, it's not the sort of direct, immediate perception isn't necessarily like ultimate truth. I've actually been corrected on this recently. In all but the last Prasangika Madhyamaka school, they talk about conventional reality as being mistaken. You know, that conventional reality is mistaken with respect to how it sees reality. But what was, and I was corrected by like the Dalai Lama's translator on this, which is really like an authoritative source. And he said, but in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, there isn't seen to be a contradiction between conventional reality and an ultimate reality. That he said it is just like, it's like the difference between seeing a tree up close and far away. So this is one of these aspects of tenets that I think is very confusing, and I think it's easier to speak in the rougher way of just saying conventional reality is a little bit mistaken and ultimate reality is seeing things through an interdependent lens. But from the Prasangika Madhyamaka view, it's seen to be correct. And I looked up sources like the Dalai Lama's new book, this philosophical topics, really great book that he just published. You know, he writes about this too, that the conventional reality in the Prasangika, like the last school, it's like the seeing cause and effect like incomplete, you know, like seeing sort of everyday cause and effect, kind of like we do in this first school. Like we don't quite go all the way, you know, to as far as the other schools do in the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So I want to answer that, even though this goes beyond like today's topic. I want to answer that in the way that I recently came to understand it a little bit better, because this is the big problem with tenets, is you have terms that have different definitions between the different schools. So you have conventional reality, meaning, so that slightly mistaken or very mistaken way of seeing reality, and then ultimate reality being, you know, each school's view of ultimate truth. Like in this first school, the atomist school, the ultimate reality are these indivisible atomic particles of, you know, matter, and also the indivisible atomic moments of consciousness. So that's ultimate in the first, you know, in the first school, that's ultimate reality, are those indivisible moments. And conventional reality is the illusion that we see them coming together. But that illusion of coming together isn't necessarily like wrong. The thing that's wrong is the permanent, partless, you know, independent sense of self. That's the thing that doesn't exist at all. And that's a very harmful illusion. But the everyday like convention of seeing things composed, I think it's nice, since most of us are, you know, this, you know, we're like Gelugpa school. It's nice, that reminder that there's not necessarily a contradiction between conventional and ultimate reality in the everyday way of experiencing it, like where things perform functions, and cause and effect appears to operate, you know, things just even from a very ordinary way, that, you know, things don't just pop out of nowhere. That's seen as like the lighter version of conventional reality. That's accurate, like the accurate way, when we don't feel that's not infused with this strong independent sense of self. Anyway, is that a useful answer? Does that help?
So I'm always very, very confused with this definition. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. What's your further questions? Because it might help everybody, including me.
Sorry, a further question from me?
Yeah. Do you have any further questions on that, or was that a reasonable?
Now the question that comes now is, so if we do analyze it, because I'm talking from my perspective. So I see this object, and it's very solid, and it's very separate, and it's very the way I see it, it's also permanent. But if I analyze, get to understand, okay, so for sure it's not permanent, because in 100 years this notebook is going to be dust possibly.
Yeah.
But so already I am into the analysis. But so as I am into the analysis, and I am saying, oh, it's actually impermanent, I am still in the conventional truth. Is this a conventional truth? Or because I tend to see, okay, so there is the solid notebook and the permanent notebook, and that's a complete illusion. So it doesn't fall into any of the two truths, because the word truth would makes me think is two aspects of something that is actually true. But as you said also earlier, these words are confusing. What is real?
Yeah. Yes. So from this school, for the first three schools, the conventional truth is seen to be mistaken. Like the conventional truth of seeing that notebook as like a solid singular entity is seen as a mistaken view. And then the ultimate truth is that it's made out of particles, partless particles, you know, which we can call atoms, like the old-fashioned idea of atoms. It can be stated quite clearly, you know. I mean, to realize it is another thing, but and don't you think, like, the thing is, we did very long versions of these meditations, which personally I find very beneficial. Like, I think the key is to go into like a lot of detail with the analysis. Can help you, and then you know, eventually you have some sort of feeling that goes beyond that analysis. But even this first school is very, very beneficial. I mean, imagine if everybody on the planet did this meditation and just was always aware that things were made out of everything was made out of parts, and like our strong attachment was, kind of an illusion, you know, when you break things down into their components, and that thought itself can be broken down into individual moments. Like just that's also, it's very beneficial, right? SCB or oh, sorry, do you want to?
Oh, hi, Scott. Sorry,
Yeah.
Cyril.
Cyril, hi.
Hi. Yeah, my question, I guess, has to do when you asked the question, does seeing reality as a collection of partless part, does that reduce our attachment? And I really thought about this question because to me, I mean, both conventional reality and absolute reality are both valid.
Yes, yeah.
What makes conventional reality invalid is our attachment to it. And as soon as we are attached, we see it as permanent. We see it as it's the attachment process that makes us exaggerate conventional reality to something that is more permanent, independent, and unitary. The question is I don't see how then if I think of reality as comprised of partless part, it doesn't really makes me reduce my attachment to my phone. Like, for example, I think of my phone as a collection of all these minerals. Whether if I lose it, I'll still be as pissed,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, you know, there's something to that. That's I mean, you know, the higher schools would agree with you, right? But I don't know. I personally, like, I find, and also from leading this meditation with lots of people, and from my own experience too, I find it very beneficial. Actually, like, I'm very attached to my wife, for example, as many of us are, to our partners. But then when I look at her and sort of see, like, wow, just this swirling cloud of hydrogen and carbon, like, there's something that really helps a lot, actually, when I do think of that, like wow, what an interesting illusion, you know, that the way you see things, because I see her very solidly and, you know, in strong ways, sometimes strong love or attachment, sometimes strong aversion and anger. And it really does help, I find, even this, you know, this first school's view, just to add some perspective, like, wow. And, you know, and the sounds, like the sounds coming from her voice is like the vibration of air. Like, why would that delight me or anger me? You know, just the vibration of air. So personally, from my perspective, I do find, and I also find, you know, many students find, like, just this physical and psychological analysis in the first school really does help a lot of time. Like, why is this vibrating air making me angry? You know, or why is this invisible electromagnetic spectrum giving me such a strong feeling of, you know, sexual attraction or hunger, desire? I do find it very useful, and I think a lot of students do. But in that way, I think you can see from some people's, probably not for everybody, but.
No, I see now what you mean. And my other question was, at the end of this meditation, where does the part of, I mean, how does this meditation lead us to see non-duality, non-separateness, interdependence? That part, it wasn't clear to me on how meditating on arriving at these partless part, then is it because we're all made from what's in the iPhone, or we're all made of atom? Is that the step?
Yeah, well, see, I mean, that comes later, right? Like, I mean, it's a really good point, right? Because there's less of a view of, like, cause and effect in this perspective. You know, you just get down to the parts and there you are. But then when we look in like, especially in Prasangika Madhyamaka, like, the cause and effect is very, very important. The, you know, mind parts and the different analysis, like, that's a different analysis we'll do later with the mind parts and causes analysis. So, but you see, it's very good. Like, if your mind jumps to these questions, like, it's like in the Lam Rim, you know, they say that if you really meditate well on each topic, it naturally leads you to the next. So I think it's the same with the tenet school. Like, what you're asking is exactly the question that like Vasubandhu asked himself, you know, like, wait a minute. And then he started thinking about cause and effect, and it led to the next schools, like in the mind only and in the Prasangika, in the Yogacara and the Prasangika Madhyamaka schools, let's go, you know, mind and middle way schools, let's say, then you think a lot more about cause and effect, very deeply and subtly. So I think those are good experiences. Those like the logical experience to have, I think, when you do these meditations, because you're not thinking as much about cause and effect.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the role of the mind, you know, the role of cause and effect and the role of the mind. We don't think as much about those, like the interdependence between the mind and reality and cause and effect. So it makes you really appreciate the more subtle views, you know, like especially the middle way view is very, very subtle. Not like I understand it, but as time goes on, I feel a more subtle understanding. Any other questions? I know we're a little bit over time. If we need to stop, that's fine.
I've got a question referring to the thing about Vasubandhu saying it's like steps, like the Lamrim, that we sort of meditate or experience ourselves through those steps. Would it make sense to go for the next week and then allocate some time to see things in this mode, like saying, oh, it's just atoms in the phenomena, it's atoms in me, and then quite soon intellectually I would come to this absurd notion of this cake, which would be absolutely appalling if I saw it on the table with rotten ingredients. However, the very minute it just manifests, it's becoming absolutely divine. I know that, but I would love the cake, obviously. But then train myself for a week to go allocate 1 hour every day to just see things as atoms, to habituate me to seeing that. Would it make sense?
I would say so. In general, with any class like this, it'd be good to try to see things and do the meditation. You don't have to do it so long, but see things and do this type of emptiness meditation for the whole week and see how you relate to it. That's really good. I didn't make any homework, but that would be good homework if anybody wants to do it. See, I just think it's hugely, if people just had this, again, this is the Theravada view too. Like this isn't like an obscure perspective. It's the Theravada view on emptiness, and it's helped people achieve extraordinary realizations. So yeah, I think it would be very beneficial. Yeah, Wolfgang, do we have time for Wolfgang's question?
Sure.
Hello, Mr. Snibbe. I don't understand why it is not possible that we are in our center, the non-materialistic awareness, the pure consciousness.
Yeah. Well, then that leads to the third school. So definitely show up for the third class. Honestly, that's kind of my favorite, to be honest. I think probably that's maybe one of the most exciting parts of this class is the third class, because I really talk a lot about how valid and how powerful that mind-only school is. And also, to make this class, I tracked down a lot of very, very obscure, many unpublished references, notes from some of my teachers and French teachers, all kind of people. And it's a great text by Vasubandhu I studied. And when you look at the way that the mind-only school presents itself, it's not as easily refuted as the way Gelugpa refutes it. Because the Gelugpa refutation always seemed to me too easy. Like how could Vasubandhu, this great genius, like I couldn't imagine him having such a simplistic view that of the things that we refute of karmic seeds and the storehouse consciousness. Sorry to get into these details, but we'll do this in an accessible way in the third class. But again, your question, it's exactly the question you should be asking. Like that means that you've effectively done the meditation, because it leads you to the next phases of tenets, right? Like it's totally reasonable to have that conclusion, and great. Again, like Vasubandhu had this conclusion himself and then moved on to start to be an adherent of that school. So we're recapitulating like 2,000 years of Buddhist history over 4 weeks in this class. You see how fun and exciting tenets can be. Like, it doesn't have to be like so totally painful to your brain. So yeah, we'll do that so make sure you come for the third class. That one, I have to say, I mean, it's funny to say, but it really is my favorite, maybe because I was raised that way, but also because I think there's really a lot to this school. And it was Venerable Sangye Kajo who turned me on to this, because I asked her these questions a couple of years ago, and she turned me on to a great book where I started studying this. So I think it'll be really fun for you to do that third class. So come back for that. All right. We should probably finish up, right? It's late for you guys.
Yes, I think it's also nice to stop by this time. And Scott, thank you for these valuable, introduction into this understanding of the school and the wonderful meditations. And thank you for coming here and coming back. So a lot of thank yous. And also to everybody coming here tonight, thank you for your patience and thank you for being here. Hopefully we'll see each other next Thursday.